Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ask GN. As always, before we get started, if you've got questions, post them in the comments section below. Had a couple repeat questions from previous episodes. Finally, we'll be getting to those today. So we've got some interesting stuff on SSDs, on GPUs, GPUOpen, and GameWorks, things like that. Before we get into that, this content this week is brought to you by the AMD RX 470 and 480 cards, which can be had for under $200 depending on where you're looking right now, because Cyber Monday and Black Friday, and of course, regardless of when this video is posted, those deals, I'm sure, will continue basically forever, because that's what retailers do now. It's not Black Friday, it's Black November, as you well know if you've been to Newegg. They actually call it that. So, without further ado, the first question is from Ulam5, who says, Steve, are there noticeable real-world benefits to using M.2 SSDs like the Intel 600P, which, by the way, we just included in one of our buyer's guides, or Samsung 860 EVO over conventional SATA 3 SSDs, like even shorter boot or load times, or are there insane numbers from M.2 drives being bottlenecked by other stuff like software, CPU, GPU? First part of the question, obviously, and I'm sure this is clear for the most part, but M.2 drives do have the benefit of they can be used in places where SATA might not be, like a smaller system. But ignoring that and looking just at the speed part of the question, it depends. So for boot times, I am rebenching a bunch of SSDs, including M.2 drives, so I'll be doing boot time measurements. I don't have an answer for you right now if it's actually noticeable. If anything, it's a couple seconds, because boot times are already so fast that, yeah, you will be bottlenecked at some level by things like Windows' ability to sort itself out, and then just in BIOS alone, whatever your settings are there, you can enable things like fast boot, get rid of the usual post kind of delay that you have and things like that, get rid of the splash screens, but those will be limiters almost more to some extent than the SSD, depending on what SSD you're using. But as far as the other tests, games will be limited by a couple of things, mostly the game and its engine and its programming. So those can only really load so fast most of the time. I don't really, even with a hard drive, like I can't remember what games we tested last time we did an SSD review, but for the most part, the loading times between levels was pretty minimal. Now there are a couple of exceptions to this, like Battlefield 1, and I think Battlefront makes sense, same engine. I think those two games actually load noticeably quicker with an SSD. So we used like a HyperX Predator SSD, which is an M.2 AIC. So it's an M.2 SSD on an add-in card for PCI Express. I used that back then for that testing, and then also used traditional hard drive for another test system, and it was actually noticeably quicker with the load times. So there are instances where an SSD at all makes a difference. Whether or not you see it with M.2 versus SATA, I would say those differences are almost entirely relegated to things like production workloads, where if whatever you're doing is capable of writing, say, upwards of 2 gigabytes per second, because there's no bottlenecks anywhere in the system, like maybe for example, if you're executing a script to do mass file transfers where there's no encode, decode, or transcoding involved, and it's just basically moving stuff, then yeah, you'd see a difference there, because the sequential times, especially the reads, are so much faster on some of those M.2 drives. But you're going to be limited for games by plenty of other things in the system where I don't think you'll see a huge difference in loading times. Now, that said, come back in a week or two, because I'll be visiting that topic more thoroughly and actually have some test data for you that I can provide to give more actual numbers about the differences, and not just say is it noticeable or is it not noticeable. But in general, the main use case, if you set out to buy an M.2 drive or an NVMe enabled drive, you are primarily looking at things like, am I limited by the physical layout of my system? Can I fit a SATA SSD in there if it's 2.5 inch? And there are SATA drives. I'll talk about this in the future, but there's SATA enabled M.2, PCIe lanes are split off depending on NVMe versus SATA interfaces, stuff like that. All dictated kind of by the HSIO setup on your chipset, or dictated by the drive itself. talking about that soon, but basically the answer is not really a huge difference unless you're doing production things with mass file movement or a lot of really fast write times from whatever your production environment is. In those cases, you'll see a difference. For things like capture server, for example, we've set up a capture server for things like FCAT, where it live captures the gameplay and records it. That's an instance where you would want RAID SSDs if you're running off of SATA, or something like an Intel 750 series NVMe drive, which is what I'm using for our capture server, because anything short of that is not necessarily fast enough and you start to lose data, and that's bad. But that's a really specific use case. That's a kind of reviewer use case. That gives you an idea though. Next question, Tech Pascal asks, I was wondering if you can explain in greater detail overclocking processes and what they mean as far as power, target, memory offset, voltage, etc. Also, what's the process you go through each overclock? So for specific architectures, we've got videos and articles about how to overclock Maxwell, Pascal, and Polaris. So you can check those content pieces for that. To very briefly go over this, the question about power target. So power target setting is basically you have a GPU. It says, maybe in the instance of a higher end GPU, it says something like, I want 180 watts. And that's at 100% of the power target. And then if you offset that, normally you get 20 to 30% offset depending on what it is. AMD GPUs, some of them do 50% offset. Within the same GPU from different vendors, you might get 20 or 30% offset. The reason that is because the percentage, as always, is kind of a little bit deceptive, because it's, with Gigabyte, for instance, the Extreme Water card that reviewed the 1080, I think technically has a higher percentage offset than EVGA's hybrid, but the base wattage is lower as well. So it comes out to be about the same once you account for that. But that percentage offset basically says, if we're drawing 100 watts now, we offset it an additional 20 watts. Now you can draw 120 watts, so you've got more power headroom for the clock. So with Nvidia and with AMD, basically you're looking at, am I thermally limited? No. Okay, so we'll push the clock. Okay, so now let's check again. Am I limited by power? No, not really. So then next check, am I limited by voltage? Yes. Okay, so then the user can do a voltage offset. You've got really limited playroom with that for current GPUs that are out there. You only get so much in terms of millivolts offset, and GPU Boost 3.0 is a little bit strange with it. It's kind of hard to work with. But basically, the question is, power target gives you more power headroom, which allows you to increase the clock rate of the card, which gives you, of course, a higher FPS to some extent. And then it does increase thermals, though. It also increases clock rate stability, because if you've got, let's say, an offset power target, but you haven't touched your GPU clock rate, now there's some room where if the GPU runs into a scenario where it becomes power limited normally under 100% offset, or sorry, 100% power target, it would throttle the clock back temporarily until it regains its footing, so to speak. Whereas if you offset the power target and you have extra headroom but you've not overclocked, now you can sustain that boost clock basically at a flat level if you were to plot it over time, and that's beneficial for reducing things like the occasional stutter in your gameplay and things like that. I think that answers the basics though. Next question is from Apoorv Gahlot, who says, hey Steve, I wanted to ask if desktop replacements like the Acer Predator 21X really make sense. I mean, battery life will be laughable, so what exactly makes them buyable? Yeah, so the battery life's not great on any of those. Cyber powers units we've looked at, things like that. You might get kind of best case scenario if it's a single GPU, like an hour gaming, which is not great, and it's also not great battery just for normal use either, because of the nature of having higher end hardware, bigger screen that demands more power, things like that, but or higher resolution. But I guess the kind of use cases are, first of all, these are all, for the most part, either loss leaders or Halo products. So they're not necessarily meant to be how a company makes its money. It's more of like, let's get eyes on our company. And then just like with the Corsair Obsidian series cases, like the 900D, not a ton of people buy that. That's really meant to be more of a halo product. And the idea is that people who see the 900D are like, oh, this is a really high quality case, so then they recommend whatever's below it. And it's the same idea with the laptops. Now, as far as usability, the use cases for these desktop replacements are basically, are you a person who commutes between work and home and you need your own system in both locations? If so, and if it needs to be a high-end system, then you get one of these and you plug it into a dock on the other side and you use it as a desktop. Now, the question is, well, why would you use that? Why would you need that much power? If you're doing something like rendering, like we do, we need effectively desktop replacements for when we're traveling to conventions to render the videos out fast enough and with whatever filters we want to apply. It's really just not possible on smaller laptops for the most part with the speed that we need. But that system's basically plugged into a wall 100% of the time, so it's okay. It's just not super mobile. So the market is again, basically production or strange use cases, maybe something like is someone who's moving around frequently between 2 or more locations where they live or work. That's basically it. But they aren't really meant to be kind of the main way for a company to make money. Next question, N3 Zeniaka 5 is saying, how to ground yourself when working on a build. I heard that you can touch the power supply grill to do that, but does it have to be plugged in, turned on? Also, how do you use an anti-static wrist bracelet? Do you attach it to any metal surface or to a PC plugged in? I have one of those. So the setup we have is a little more elaborate than you necessarily need. But the way I do it, we've got an anti-static mat, not necessary. But this plugs into the mat, and that will handle any ESD basically from whoever's wearing it and dissipate it through the surface rather than into devices. And then for it to actually work properly, it's got to go somewhere, obviously. So this is just a metal hook. It's just a circle that goes around a ground pin, in our case, on anything that plugs into a wall. So the way I do it for anti-static bracelets is you've got 2 main modes. Normally, you'll buy them, like the Rosewell ones, for a couple bucks. You buy them, they'll often have an alligator clip at the end of it, and you can actually pull those off. It's not going to hurt anything. And then this is under it, which is a banana plug, it's called. You can plug those into special banana plug outlets in a wall, so you can buy basically an adapter for your normal wall outlet and plug this straight into it, and you connect this to a bracelet on the other end. That's one option. Another option is you get something like we've got set up, where you have the loop at the end, the metal loop. This hooks around the ground pin. In the US, at least, that's going to be the 3rd pin, the large circular one. Hooks onto that, and then you plug that into the wall, and anything that would be coming off of me through the wrist bracelet would go basically down the cable into the wall, into earth, and be gone. So that's how we deal with it. And you can do it you can kind of hack an ESD solution. One option I did previously, did a video on, was taking a power cable, like a standard power supply power cable, and you just basically cut the head off one end, clip the hot wires, and leave the ground wire. You strip the housing off of it, leave it exposed copper. Then you can clamp into that. That would be a way to hack it and be successful. You can kind of touch a metal surface. It becomes a bit questionable how effective that is. So one, if you're touching something like a power supply or a case, it's got to have a path to ground. So ideally you're plugged in with the power supply not on, because you don't want it on when you're building. But then there's issues with, like, for instance, paint. Paint is really not a great interface to have between you and your means of grounding. It'll probably work okay, but some of that might just be because you've not encountered a scenario where ESD was an issue. So hard to say how effective that is. But that would be my backup. Yeah, clip into the power supply grill, plug it into a wall, and then you should probably be okay. But these solutions are a bit more effective, and some of them aren't too expensive. This next question I'm not going to answer, but I wanted to point it out. So it's from Il2Xbox, who said, basically asked about, are there any games that use GPU acceleration for character AI? If not, is it something devs can do in the future? If I understand correctly, AI and machine learning algorithms can generally benefit a lot from using a GPU, basically parallelism on a GPU. I agree. It's a really interesting question. So I emailed that out to AMD and to Nvidia, and we'll see if I get an answer. And if so, I'll address it next week. But I do not know. That's out of my area of expertise. Next question is from Mike Smith, who says, how long do heat pipe coolers last? I've had one for 3 years or more, 3 different rigs now, still working well. So basically forever. Heat pipe coolers don't really die. They're not like liquid coolers. They do have liquid, basically liquid in the heat pipes, but that's a sealed system. So unless it's encountered some damage, that liquid's not going to escape anytime soon, because it's designed to sort of evaporate and then use capillary action, come back down. So it's not getting out of there. But yeah, they basically last forever. The only thing you're going to replace is the fan. That's a cheap replacement. Next question, Orvis25, who says, hey Steve, second time asking, can you explain GPUOpen, AMD, and GameWorks Nvidia, specifically what the differences are and what they do, and why GameWorks is still used far more than GPUOpen in games, specifically when GPUOpen is free and open source. GameWorks is also free. Nvidia doesn't charge for that. So I'll briefly do this. If you want GPUOpen stuff, I do have a pretty long interview with Raja Koduri on the channel. You can watch that. He explains it pretty well. Just search GPUOpen, one word, and that interview will come up. He does, of course, a better job explaining it than I can in a short amount of time, because that's what he does. But to get the basics here, the question was, why isn't GPUOpen used as much, even though it's free and open source? Again, both are free. GPUOpen's pretty new, relatively. GameWorks in its current form has been around a little while, but also it was preceded by individual, effectively, plugins. It wasn't always the GameWorks SDK. It was individual stuff. It's all kind of been packaged into one now. So let's do GameWorks first. GameWorks is effectively a collection of libraries that developers can pick and choose and plug into their engine or game. So an instance of use might be, if I'm a developer and I say, I want some fire effects that are pre-calculated, pre-written, maybe it's dynamic fire that spreads, something like that. And also I don't want to write it myself, because that's too time consuming, too expensive, too hard. In that case, you'd go pull the Nvidia GameWorks SDK and the library for fire and plug it in, and it's mostly done. You do some fine-tuning, things like that, and Nvidia and AMD both have engineers available to developers to help with that sort of thing, optimization. Another option would be same idea, but for fur or hair, like what The Witcher did. And obviously, these plugins, these libraries are going to be optimized for Nvidia hardware. Nvidia made it. They're certainly not going to optimize on behalf of their competitor, and they're probably going to build in a way that would work well on their hardware, and maybe that doesn't work so well on their competitor's hardware. Again, tessellation with Hairworks in The Witcher 3, at least natively at launch anyway. So that's kind of the basics. Now the next question, what about GPUOpen? GPUOpen does, it's a bit more things. It does kind of the same thing at a top level, which is a collection of libraries that can be used to better effects in a game. But also GPUOpen is trying to sort of collate AMD's knowledge, at least, into a more accessible package for developers to get to and implement in their games. And what I mean by that is AMD and Nvidia have very specific knowledge in how to optimize drivers and games to interact with their hardware. And this is done constantly. This is why you can see improvements 20 or 30% sometimes with drivers, because the developer doesn't necessarily know, I'm working with this particular particle effect or fire effect or whatever. It should be drawn this way with this video card. They don't necessarily know that or optimize for it. And that's what the two companies will do, the vendors. Now, with the new APIs, that's sort of going away. So this driver layer is becoming very thin as the GPUs interface more directly with the software. So you've got several abstraction layers removed. Still a couple in there, like the compilers, making sure the code is all legal, but there's not as much driver interaction as there used to be. So GPUOpen is trying to go out and inform developers how to optimize their games properly without relying necessarily on a third-party package like a driver. So that's kind of a newer effort. And again, the interview with Raja kind of answers the rest of that. But I think that gives you a starting point, at least, as to what each does. It's not to say either is better or worse than the other, but that's what they do. What else do we have here? Very quickly, I'll answer this because I've answered this. So D2 Ricky said, why aren't we seeing huge gains in DX12 out of the top end of DX12 GPUs, similar to draw call API tests? Is this due to the majority testing on super high-end hardware or more testing is being done at higher resolutions? No. We've tested both. It's basically that I've said this several times, I think most recently in the Battlefield 1 CPU or GPU benchmark, if you're curious. The articles might give you more on that. But to very quickly recap, DirectX 12 and Vulkan are not free performance gimmies for the developers. It's not, let's plug into DX12 and we get free performance with the CPU pulling draw calls, or draw calls being pulled from the CPU to the GPU. That's not really quite how it works. They have to do a lot of low-level optimization. They have to build specifically for their effects, their processing, their job management within the engine. So it's not a free game. And a lot of the time, at least earlier with DX12, what you end up with is what's called a wrapper. So it's a DirectX 12 wrapper. It's not actually doing anything at a low level. It just calls the DX12 API. So it looks like DX12 to the user, but performance might actually be slightly worse than DX11 or OpenGL. And that's why with early testing, you saw negative scaling because it wasn't actually built for the API, not ground up anyway. And it's just being wrapped and it's basically executing in another API or at a less, not quite as low level on the hardware as you would hope for one of those low level APIs. So that pretty much, that answers really most of the questions. One from last week that I messaged Michael Kearns, one of our writers, about because he's an expert in keyboards a bit more than I am. The question was from Basan Batirov, who said, basically was asking, got my hands on G610 Orion Brown keyboard. I haven't had any mechanical keyboards in my possession before, so I really had high hopes for this one. To put it mildly, I was disappointed. The keys felt mushy, almost no tactile bump, modifiers were loud, felt more like a membrane keyboard to me. I tried Razer Black Widow before, and those were satisfying to press. And I asked Michael Kearns what he thought. He said, quote, okay, so it sounds like you don't like Cherry MX Browns, i.e. you don't like light tactile switches. A decent amount of people, myself included, don't. On the other hand, you like light clicky switches like the Cherry MX Blue or Razer Green clears and Ergo clears. Oh, yeah, there's a decent amount of people who like, what am I reading here? there's a decent amount of people like you, and what a lot of people like Cherry MX clears and Ergo clears. Thank you, Michael, for spell checking this for me. And says MX clears are somewhat stiff in that they take more force than Cherry MX Browns or Razer Greens, but Ergo clears, a mod, and he's got a link to that, deskauthority.net will have the mod for Ergo clears, are like Cherry MX Browns, what you used, but with a more pronounced bump, so you may like them more. I would suggest trying MX clears as they are somewhat easy to find in keyboards, and while Ergo clears may be a bit better for you, they aren't easy to find and require hand customization generally. So there's your answer to that. As always, if you've got more questions, anyone, post them in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Patreon link in the post, video, subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.